do want to share a couple things before this gentleman comes forward. I got some exciting news this week that we're going to stretch out and move suicide groups possible. Well, Hibbing for sure, and possibly Bemidji. So I'm pretty excited about that. Yeah. We're also going to put on a presentation, which is going to be called "If We Can Reach Just One," and it's going to have me and Mac and Nicole, Janet, and several of the mothers from the Wednesday group. And we're going to go around to different towns and present our story. The first time it will be presented is here at Keebler at the end of September, so after the walk, once we get everything else done. So. But we're pretty excited about that. There's some exciting stuff coming up, so hopefully you guys can all be a part of it. Be patient with me. I can't remember what I was going to say, but this gentleman here, you're from Fergus Falls, right? Mr. Steve McMurray. That's close enough. I've been trying to pronounce it all day and I can't. So.
It took me a couple of years to get it.
This gentleman here has worked with a lot of people that have struggled with suicide, and I've talked to him a little bit. It's very interesting to listen to, and hopefully you guys enjoy what he has to say. So give it to him.
Can y'all hear me okay without the microphone? Get better. I've never tried public speaking before, so it could have been my so thanks for letting me practice. I wrote a presentation, but I started thinking, what would help y'all the most? Just to tell you the story that I've already written, or we can be interactive and you can throw questions. What would be the most beneficial for y'all?
We like stories.
Okay. Once upon a time. All right. I'm probably going to be hiding in this a lot, as close as I get to a security blanket. So my name is Steve. I come from Fergus Falls. I'm a board certified nurse coach down there. And today we're going to talk about choosing to see through suicide. So thanks for coming. As we kick things off, y'all do mindfulness practices here? Okay. So as we kick things off, I want to invite each of y'all to be present here. Let's take some slow, deep breaths together. Inhale yourself into this space and exhale all the distractions back outside. If you're comfortable, close your eyes. Feel yourself settling into your chair. Your feet grounded on the floor. Take a deep breath in through your nose. Feel your rib cage lifting and your shoulders lifting, drawing yourself in. Breathe out through your mouth. leaving all those other thoughts at home or at school or at work right now. Right now, there is nowhere else you need to be. There is nothing else you need to do. The only thing right now is to be present. When you're ready, open your eyes. I'm going to tell you all a story. Most of the good stories start with on a dark and stormy night. But this one, it was a hot and sunny day, summertime in Connecticut. And I was parked at the end of an empty parking lot, sitting in the sleeper of my semi, looking down the barrel of my revolver. The hammer was back, my thumb was on the trigger. I don't recommend it, but I do know what the bullet looks like from inside a gun. That's the first time that I had to choose to set the gun down. And it was way harder to set it down than it had been to pick it up. How did I happen to be in the sleeper, ready to commit suicide? And stay tuned, and I'll talk with you about the shame that I've spent decades trying to never talk about. I'm a transformative nurse coach. I work with individuals and with groups of people, kind of like a GPS, kind of like an interactive GPS. So clients determine where they are and where they'd like to go. And like a really interactive GPS, I help them navigate the route, including recalculating. Until recently, I've been a traveling ER nurse for almost my entire nursing career. Now I work in the mental health unit at my local hospital. Prior to becoming a nurse, my family and I moved to Ferguson in 2012 to work for Ringgold as a paramedic. I am not a mental health professional. I'm not either a therapist or a counselor. My suicidal thoughts began in 1997 in the back of that semi, immediately before picking up that revolver. The suicide funnel began as a teenager, but I didn't know about it back then. Even in the beginning, I wasn't naive about my innocence and having a little innocent fun, but just because it's a sin, what's really the harm at looking at magazines? Some say marijuana is a gateway drug to the harder ones. As I've lived it out, magazines could be substituted for marijuana. I know about the thoughts and the feelings that lead to the suicide funnel by living them, and how to claw back out of it by standing for the fight. For so many years, I wore my custom-fitted suit of shame. Many of us do, don't we? What created shame for me might not have for you, and the other way around. The shame suit is custom cut. It's tailor-made. The shame suit's transparent so that you and I, the people wearing them, don't need to be. That's how you can know someone really well and not know about that one outfit that they never take off. When I was a paramedic, my coworkers and I responded to lots of suicides or to suicide attempts. When I became an ER nurse, those patients and often their broken, shock-struck families came to me. Now in the mental health unit, anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, those are the most common complaints. So this will be gritty. I don't know how to talk about suicide that wouldn't be. And I'm probably going to touch raw nerves. In fact, I hope to. I'm not doing it to be mean or for drama. I'm doing this because the way to take the teeth out of the monster is to reach in and take the teeth out. And I'm doing it as much for me as I am for y'all. In order to do this, I have to face my own monsters and reach in and take their teeth out. I'd like for y'all to see me as just another guy in the audience. I'm not a top-down expert. If there's any facts and figures, charts, statistics, like John Maxwell talks about, I put all the cookies on the lower shelf so that everyone can have some. Stats would be easy, aren't they? Googling can get you stats. For instance, in 2020, 723 people died by suicide in Minnesota. In 2021, that number increased to 777. 777. That says nothing about the 10,000 or so cases of self-injury and suicide attempts that were treated. It's easy to gloss over this fact, or else it gets lost in the delivery. Right before they became a Minnesota Department of Health statistic, each one of those 777 events was a real person. Probably hopeless, at least in that moment. But they also had thoughts and feelings, either dreams or dreams they had lost. They each had families, they had friends. Minnesotans, they probably like that purple football team. Some of them like fishing, some were on the boat. They were people. So you hear about risk factors for suicide and protective factors, talked about lots of different ways by the people who research it. I'm not a researcher. I'm a guy who's lived with the thoughts, who's hidden behind the masks and carried the shields so that no one can get close to me. And I've talked with hundreds of patients from a broad cross-section of society who were either planning their exit strategy, who had made the attempt, or were who trembling and screaming while holding a note left by a new statistic. No? Let's meet them. So my name's Steve. All the other names are going to be made up. The people I'm going to talk to you about have entrusted me with fragments of their stories, but they really are their stories, not mine. From all of those conversations, I found that there are 4 different groups of people that are directly impacted by suicide. So one of those is a guy named Eric. He was a patient of mine. He was actively considering it in the process of formulating his plan. I'm in the second group, somebody who's gone right up to the edge and then chosen to walk away. My friend Ronald, my former coworker, who's made the attempt and survived. Or my friend Francine, the family and friends who are left behind or find themselves suddenly surprised by one of us, folks in the other 3 groups. So Eric had been a patient. It was a light duty night in the ER, and I had time to either hang out at the nurse's station or to invest in the patient. I really enjoy interesting patients, and suicide is one of my high value topics. And so I went to see Eric. He was waiting another couple hours for transport to arrive. His workup had been done, placement was already arranged. I asked him if he was willing to talk with me, and told him if he ever changed his mind, I'd walk out and he could be alone. Well, Eric didn't like the solitary confinement that is an ER room. Have any of y'all experienced that? Gone to the ER for help and you find yourself in solitary confinement? That's what we do. I was the only person that he'd met in the ER who had actually introduced themselves. So he was happy to chat. For all the world to see, Eric was doing well. He and his wife were expecting their first baby in a couple of months from then. They were both excited about that. He'd recently been promoted to a manager's role at his company. So he was doing well. For the past month or so, Eric had been studiously researching his exit strategy. In fact, for him, he got caught on the computer by his wife looking up how to tie a noose. So he'd been talking with counselors and with his wife, better communication than my wife and I have sometimes. But despite all that, he was still researching and planning. Eric described himself as hopeless. He'd been promoted to his new position and he hated it. He wanted to go back to being the worker bee instead of being the manager. But he felt he'd be letting everyone down if he asked. His wife, because that other job paid less money, and his company, because they had just promoted him. And promotions are always a good thing, right? Eric had been great in his previous role. He was miserable in his new one. He'd fallen into what's called people pleasing. And so he was living for everyone else instead of for himself. And suicide was his ticket out. Ronald shot himself in the head and woke up a couple of weeks later, surprised to be in a hospital and depressed that he was still alive. Ronald was in law enforcement and didn't like the person he was expected to be while at work. It had been fun and exciting, but the years of all that aggressiveness had worn on him. It's an old story. He and his work buddies worked their shifts and then drank away their off-duty days and weekends. Drinking worked until no amount of blood alcohol content kept the thoughts of the things he had done at work in the dark where Ronald had put them. Even the drinking wasn't fun anymore, but it stuck. Ronald was haunted by the expectations to be the guy he had become at work and haunted by the images of things he was continuing to do. And now the alcohol that had helped quiet it all had become another monster. Plus, he still had the first one. Ronald was stuck. He was ashamed of who he had become and he didn't know how to talk about what he was feeling. And those feelings themselves brought another kind of shame up because he should be able to handle it. Ronald was already drunk when he got to his dad's house. He slurred his way through goodbyes, told his dad he was going to watch the ships at the docks, and drove, hammered, to a hotel room. He checked in, then it was over. He woke up 2 weeks later, surprised to be awake and depressed that he was still alive. The voices in his head confirmed that he was a failure. Even with a gun in his hand, he couldn't kill himself right. My friend Francine had been puzzled that she hadn't talked to her husband that day. She became concerned when she got home and saw her dog outside, was even more worried when she got inside and noticed the anxious pacing of the other dogs. And then Francine found the note. In a last gesture of, "I love you," Francine's Frank had written instructions for her, knowing that despite her training and profession, she wouldn't be able to think clearly. Francine explained that Frank had struggled with depression for lots of years. They communicated well and openly. He would make progress and then he'd slip into depression again. And then he had a stroke. And because they didn't have insurance, they were saddled with a large hospital bill. Francine said that Frank began taking medication that their provider had not verified against his medical record, known to create depression in people with his history, but they didn't know that at the time, and Frank took the meds. Francine and I talked about being the one who was left. We talked about the everyday struggles of unanswered questions. Wasn't I good enough? What should I have done differently? Why didn't he love me? Francine was left in isolation, and Frank had felt isolated too before he died. Francine lives in a small town, and suddenly she was alone. People avoided her in the stores. They didn't want to talk about it, or they didn't know how. Pete Jr.'s in that fourth group also. Pete, my wife's and my close friend, was found in his garage by his youngest son. Pete Jr., the older son, spent some hours talking with me. Peter was the lead pastor of his church. His wife had recently been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and a month or so later she died. They had been really close, and so Peter was devastated. He was the lead pastor of his church, but he was also just a man. And then the leadership in his church took his position away and said, "Well, you can be the kids pastor." Pete Jr. and his brother no longer speak to each other, and their grandmother, Peter's mom, won't talk about it. Pete Jr. was not allowed at his own father's funeral by the leadership of the church. They met him at the door and wouldn't let him in at his own father's funeral. From Pete Jr.'s point of view, the organization that should have embraced him, the church where everybody should be able to go for support, they shut him out. Pete Jr. was angry at his dad. My former coworker, Ronald, was shunned by some of his friends and family also. "How could you do this to me? Why didn't you talk to someone?" But that someone is too often someone else. I called my friend Lance to get him to come over and talk about this presentation. Lance heard that trigger word, suicide, and he went off the rails. It took several minutes to get him back. "Are you okay? Is anybody home with you right now? Do you have a gun? Do you need me to call somebody for you?" But that was going to be calling somebody else. I hadn't called him because I was suicidal. I called him to talk about suicide. The breakdown was listening. Eric, the first guy whose life looked wonderful on the outside, his family and friends didn't know how to listen. Francine, her in-laws refused to listen. Pete Jr. and his dad, Peter, their own church and their friends in the church also wouldn't listen. When Peter's wife died, his friends brought him casserole, because that's what we do, and that'll fix everything, doesn't it? But no one sat in his living room with him and just let him be all the emotions that he needed to be. Some people wanted to fix things. Others had platitudes. Platitudes like, "You just need to get over it. Don't worry, life will get better." My dad's favorite, "Cheer up, God loves you." Suicidal ideation, or the aftermath of an attempt, isn't something that one gets over, is it? Have you all experienced that? You just pat it on the head and get over it? And from the bottom of the suicide funnel, life does not get better. In fact, it's the opposite. Platitudes increase isolation because they scream that you really don't understand. My friend Peter, the pastor, did not need hot meals dropped off by his friends who were practicing no-touch delivery. He needed to be touched. He needed his friends to sit with him. In the coaching world, we call it holding space, and when he was reeling from losing his wife and being demoted at work, he needed his friends to hold space for him. To let him be all the emotions that he needed to be. Why do we say platitudes to each other? I haven't met anybody that likes to be talked to that way. Platitudes are easy for us to say. We get to sound like we're encouraging while also not really being involved. The Nitbeck Manual of Means, it's still used in some churches today. I have read that Jesus was tempted in all ways like we are. And that if we do sin, Jesus knows exactly what that's like because he was a person like each of us. So we have one who speaks to the Father in our defense. So God and his favorite son were approachable, two figures I have never seen. But my dad, who I saw every day, was not approachable. My dad frequently said, "Cheer up, God loves you." He very rarely said, "Son, I love you." What I needed then wasn't clinical or even religious. Do this or don't do that. What I needed was relational. I needed to know that my dad loved me and that he had the same kind of thoughts and ideas that I was having. I needed to know that even if he didn't approve, if he was disappointed in a church choice that I had made, my dad would walk beside me and help me work through it. Instead, anger at being stuck in behavior that I both liked and hated. What I got was Bible verse quotes from that ancient collection of cliches. I got platitudes. Platitudes increase the sense of isolation, the thought that I really am the only one who feels this way. Platitudes increase the distance between people, all while we smile to each other at how helpful we're being. Don't use platitudes. Platitudes are for people who want to remain sterile while still claiming involvement. A surgeon gets bound up in a sterile field, right? That's wise in that context. But when you're depressed and alone, or alone in a group of your own family and friends, which is even more isolating, you don't need someone who's sterile. That person is too clean. You can't touch them. As a paramedic, I was never sterile. I crawled into broken cars to hold the necks of people crying while the fire guys were cutting the wrecked car apart. I got down on wet grass. Once I knelt in dog poop to be next to a patient. I don't recommend that. I didn't know I did that at the time. Get on the floor. Sit in the mud that they're in. Chances are good you'll be the only one who will. Maybe y'all will stay in chairs, but regardless, don't use platitudes. When your friend is depressed, don't be a clinician. Be as dirty as they are until they're ready to listen to you because you've created connection. If you'd like to destroy any connection you have been developing, then start using platitudes. It'll be super effective at undermining that relationship. My suit of shame was woven from a dysfunctional family environment, though we did smile on Sundays because it's important at least to look like we have it together instead of being authentic. And from a growing addiction of porn. My thing doesn't have to be your thing in order for me to authentically relate to the puddle of shame that you might be sitting in. If you do anything with marketing or sales, you're familiar with a sales funnel. I think of the route to suicide as a suicide funnel. The objective of the funnel is to create interest in the people who are outside the funnel, and then the deeper they get into the funnel, the more likely they become to complete the transaction. So, if Sam and Samantha are at home watching TV and see an ad for pizza, they might get into the sales funnel, and they might not. But when Samantha's calling to ask about midweek specials, the chances that she'll complete the transaction are significantly higher. She might still back out, but odds are good that she and Sam are eating pizza in about 30 minutes. That's how the suicide funnel works. Common entryways, on-ramps that frequently lead someone to begin considering suicide as a legitimate option include gambling, pornography, cheating, financial problems, relationship breakups, being abused, being molested, being abandoned. Like that pizza ad, not all those on-ramps work for everyone, and those common entry points into the suicide funnel aren't the only ones. For me, it was porn. If this was a fun story, it would start with once upon a time. But this isn't that kind of story. So this is the first time. My bow was sighted in, a brand new arrowhead, brand new broadheads, tipped all 6 arrows. My school bag was empty. Nothing in there suggested I was an 8th grade student. I'd taken out all the pencils and notebooks and math and English books and packed it with all the things a 14-year-old boy could think to take on his first ever solo deer hunt. I was steeped in how-to survival books, but I was really short on my father's mentorship. So I packed survival blankets, matches, flint, an extra knife, socks, all manner of stuff. Who knows what you might need for a wilderness deer hunt on the outskirts of Madison, Wisconsin in early fall. My hunting partner was my classmate, a boy who lived between my house and the woods we would try. He wasn't as woodsy-wise as I was, and his backpack didn't have nearly the number of crucial things that I was carrying, but he packed one that even I hadn't thought of. And looking back, that's had more effect on my life than any of the stuff that I had brought. The weather was fantastic. The sun was still groggy, just the first sense of waking up. We thought we were master woodsmen tromping among the noble oaks in the trailer park's open spaces. We looked at it like the last outpost before the truly wild forest where we'd be hunting. And then the angry squirrels overhead gave us away. My buddy's bag didn't carry these survival essentials like mine did. Instead of equipment to survive the unknown, he brought his dad's magazines so that we could learn how to survive the unknown. Who knew? Naked women are exciting. It was weird sharing a magazine with my friend, but we laughed and pointed and pretended that we knew just exactly what to do. The truth was I was playing along after my friend's lead. That was 1987, way before Al Gore had invented the internet, and I had just been introduced to pornography. I was raised in church. I was inoculated against Christianity lots of times by the time I was flipping pages with that kid in the woods. I didn't know whether he thought it was wrong, but since he had stolen the magazines from his dad, who were hiding the magazines from his wife, chances are pretty good that even though nobody talked about it, we all knew the truth. This is wrong, and you shouldn't do it. I didn't have healthy relationships at home. Ultimately, I lived most of my teenage years in a long list of foster home placements. I went to 5 different high schools. I was even a high school dropout for a while. I never talked to anyone about the new books and magazines I learned how to buy. I became really good at hiding them, and before long, my mind was so well trained I didn't need any more images. But over the years, I kept looking at them. I was a teenager at my grandparents' house, who definitely would not approve. I spent my paper route money on porn at a store I learned wouldn't check my age. And sometimes I'd flip through pages first to read part of a book, the kind with no pictures. And then when I knew I was alone, I would chop up the magazine or book into pieces and burn it. That was the last time. Till the next time that I bought another magazine or another book, the next time that I snuck time with a hatchet. Quite often I bought the magazine and never looked at it. I just kept it until I could go outside. I didn't want to buy it, but I had to. I was sheltered from addiction in a Christian school, and I'd long since graduated from the soft porn from that deer hunt. Believe it or not, for all the talk about going deer hunting, once we learned about that other hunt, we forgot all about Danny's dad. I graduated from that soft porn long before I learned that porn works in the brain very nearly the same way that heroin and other drugs do. What began as an embarrassed interest became something fun for me to look at when I was alone. I was alone a lot. And then, without even thinking about it or even considering it, it became a safe place to disappear to. From the first glimpse in the woods, the pathway to being hooked was being built in my mind. I was never confused about this is innocent fun. Thanks to that verse in Proverbs, raise a child as he should go so that when he's old enough to use porn, he won't enjoy it. I knew that I was sinning. But before then, I already knew that God was angry with me and disappointed in me. So what's one more reason? It's important that neither the church, the Christian school, the pastors, none of the teachers, None of them taught me that God is eternally angry with me, but it's what's taught that matters, though. I didn't like the abuse I experienced at home. Even as a kid, I got the disconnect between "I love you, son," and being hit with a belt buckle, or being choked, or being thrown downstairs. But "I love you, son" wasn't said very often anyway. Like other addicts, I created coping mechanisms. Brene Brown would call them shields and masks to hide my behavior. Sometimes I went to church. Every time it was out of obligation. Occasionally, I even read that book. I know the Bible well, so I skipped the verses that were written to break chains and set captives free, and I meditated on the verses to keep condemnation. Well, more accurately, I read them like they were meant to create condemnation. With the knowledge that God's eternally angry toward me, and the reinforcement that every time I would ask for forgiveness, I would then sin again, I decided to save God some time and just quit asking for the forgiveness that I knew He was never going to give me anyway. Broken relationships, even an invisible one like that, leads to depression for the one who feels the break is their fault. This break was all mine. I'd never been anxious about eternity in hell. I earned it. I had never seen a therapist, and I didn't know anything about depression. Outside of the magazines that come in black wrappers, the only other thing I read was Louis L'Amour novels. Except somehow Robert Schuler's Self-Love slipped in there. I'd never seen a therapist. I'd never talked to a pastor about porn for that matter. That's because I didn't know that help was available. And when I did find out, I dismissed it with two other thoughts. One was, no one can help me or would want to. And two, I'm a man and I can handle this by myself. I had not reached suicidal ideation yet, but I was spiraling deeper and deeper into the suicide funnel. I wasn't opposed to suicide, I just hadn't thought about it. From 1999 to 2014, the CDC says that suicide rates went up like 24%. So in 1990 whatever, it just wasn't talked about. It wasn't seen as an option like it is now. If I had thought of suicide, I would have done it. Because I hated myself. I was secretive. That was easy when I was a truck driver. And getting a fix or taking a hit would never show up on a drug screen. Porn is rampant in the military. Some of us hid it, but others flaunted their stashes or shared. For my part, I was prudish. I acted holier than thou towards guys on my boat, judgmental about what they were doing, while I was being hypocritical because I was doing the same thing that they were, or I wanted to, and that pesky bothersome moral upbringing held me back from being as involved as I wanted to be. Like other addictions, my behavior became increasingly dangerous over time. I went places that would have killed my Sunday school teachers to hear about, and I met people who were doing things that repulsed me enough to not want to do them, but not enough that I wanted to leave. In the book of James, we read about the progression that sin takes, from the inkling of an idea, conception, the life cycle of sin, and finally death. But that's just my frame of reference. Not everyone reads the Bible. So it's the progression that a destructive action takes. Right? It starts with an idea, a thought. As we feed that thought, it becomes either a belief or a plan, which then becomes an action. In our topic, an action often ends in death. Behavior is led by thoughts. Thoughts are reinforced by behavior. When it's a vicious cycle, that cycle is vicious. There was a time when I watched porn in certain theaters. Consider going to the movies with your spouse, a date, your children. There's often a long line. Friends and neighbors greet each other fondly and cross ticket lines and hold seats for each other. And the price gouged popcorn and Coke flow like milk and honey at the promised land. Before the show starts, the lights are on. One often has to stand at the bottom of the sea of seats, scouring for either the rest of their party or perhaps the last open seat. That's not the way it is at the porn theater. No one looks at each other. No one speaks. Eyes are off the floor just enough to keep from bumping into each other. No one sits remotely close to anyone else, and absolutely no arms are wrapped around each other. Popcorn? Watching a movie with nothing but physical contact and portrayed intimacy, there's no effort is spared to prevent actual contact. I don't drink alcohol, so a bar is a strange place for me to hang out. When I went to those kinds of bars, I didn't pay for a private dance very often. I have Scottish heritage. My grandpa said I should be frugal. So almost exclusively, I watched the performer's face. By then, I'd spent lots of years looking at color photos and how much more variety really could there be. So I watched the faces. The eyes were distant, disconnected. The smiles were plastered on, held together with makeup and practice. And this overriding thought always went with me. You're a loser. She's not looking at you. She's not smiling at you. And if she wasn't at work, she wouldn't be interested in you. When my load had been spent, however much money I'd brought in with me, then even her pretended rented interest was spent too. Garth Brooks sang about looking for love in all the wrong places, searching for love in too many places. Years ago, whatever fantasies I had played in my mind, years ago I'd stopped fantasizing about finding love, and soon after that I stopped looking. In July of '97, my truck broke down in the desert south of Las Vegas. I limped it from Death Valley, California into Las Vegas at about 30 miles an hour with no air conditioning. My first taste of what hell was probably like. And I was shut down for a few days while the repairs were made. Because things are legal doesn't mean they're moral, and because we're told that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas doesn't mean that that's true. Today there's lots of talk about triggers, like what triggered you? Do you know what your triggers are? I don't know what this one was. It was probably as simple as in the springtime when kings went off to war. You know, when Dave saw Bathsheba and decided to have her come over. Or rewritten in the summer at the time when Steve should have been endlessly busy hauling freight. Whatever that trigger was, whatever started me on that particular funnel, not long after I was finally in an air-conditioned hotel room, there was a knock on the door, and the woman in the hall was much prettier than any pizza delivery guy. Similar to the sales funnel for pizza, I completed the transaction at the door, and the final sliver of Proverbs had been proved. The prostitute reduces you to a loaf of bread. I don't know, after a certain depth of hate, So, I don't know, after a certain depth of hate, whether it's possible to hate yourself even more. On the off chance that you and I were in a conversation, you never would have guessed how bad of a person I am. My array of masks and shields ensured that. I didn't have any appreciable friendships or relationships. I stopped looking in the mirror because the guy in the mirror knew everything that I had done. I didn't want to be reminded about it every time. So I stopped looking in the mirror. After the military and before driving a truck, I did have one girlfriend. Our relationship progressed. I had a hand-fisted attempt. That seems hard. So I had a hand-fisted attempt at a proposal. I asked her, do you think we should start talking about getting married? Her answer was, do you think we should start seeing other people? So I can make that into a funny story now, But at the time, it confirmed what I already knew was true. Rejection waits on the other side of most questions. On the occasion that a real woman, not one in a picture on a stage, did smile at me, I was guarded. My shields came up faster than a flash. If she ever knew who I really am, she would hate me. It was still summer that same year when I parked in an empty parking lot in Connecticut. In Las Vegas, I discovered an activity I enjoyed, despite how I feel about myself, and I'd learned that literally anything is available for purchase if you can figure out where to look and you're willing to spend the money. And I'd already reduced myself to no more value than someone's next meal. The women in Connecticut need to earn money too, and I had brought some with me. I know what the trigger was in Connecticut. I had accidentally begun chatting with a girl at the truck stop. I was shut down for a while and I had time. I asked her if she'd have dinner with me when she got off. I saw her smile begin, and just that fast my shields were up. So she declined because she already had a meeting with other friends, but I was so fragile that I didn't hear her decline. I heard rejection. Before my shield snapped into place and I had been accidentally chatting with that girl, she had started the conversation. I only talked about tasks. What door, how many toilets, where does it need to go, when does it need to be there? Where's the phone, where's the office, where's the bathroom? Or in Spanish. That girl started to chat with me, and her radiant smile and dancing eyes that were alive and laughing, not distant and disconnected like a performer, slipped past my ready shields like a thief catching guard sleeping, and I forgot to put my defenses up. I didn't have any designs on after dinner. It was as simple and clean as dinner, just a few feet from where she was standing at the cash register. I couldn't compete with her other friends, but if I looked for a different kind of woman, and if I had enough money, I wouldn't need to compete. More to the point, I would not be rejected. In some areas, resources aren't as clearly advertised as they are in Vegas. But if one puts in the effort to look, but now it wasn't once, it wasn't a one-off like we say now. Now I had become habitual. I had created a routine. I hated myself for what I did. Well, that's not really true. The truth is that I hated myself while I was doing it. I went back to my truck, drove to that empty parking lot and sat in a sleeper, unmoved and unfeeling. I happened to glance at my revolver and I instantly knew that the revolver held the answer. I sometimes dance around before making a decision, but once I get there, I go pretty fast. I sat in a sleeper, saw my revolver, and just that fast knew that the bullet held the answer. I pulled the hammer back. There was enough light that I could see the bullet at the end of the barrel. I'm left eye dominant, and I liked the justice of the Bible verse, if your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. So, my left eye would be the first part to go. My thumb was on the trigger and I started taking up slack. And then I got interrupted by a voice asking, "Are you ever going to read that book?" Well, I hadn't expected to be interrupted. Now I talk with patients a lot about intrusive thoughts, but at the time I'd never heard of such a thing and hadn't experienced it. That whispered thought caught me by surprise. "Are you ever going to read that book? Are you still curious what's in it?" So that book was Robert Schuller's Self-Love. I have no idea how I happened to have it. I live in the world of personal development now, but back then I didn't read that stuff. But somewhere I picked it up. So it won't matter in a moment, was my answer, right? If I could ever stop getting interrupted, the answer was 5.5 inches away. The voice never told me to put the gun down. Instead, if you read that book first and you still want to continue what you're doing, you'll still be able to. But if you keep doing this, you won't be able to read the book and you'll never find out what's in it. It sounds a little twisted, but that logic made sense to me. So I sat in the sleeper and I read the book. And before I finished it, I got a message. Go pick up a load. So I got back in the seat. Whatever my faults might be, I'm a really good workaholic. I looked up my destination while thinking about what I'd been reading, and also thinking that I could come back to the gun at another time. But I had a fresh trip assigned, so I didn't have time to kill myself right then. It's lots of years now since that parking lot, and after that first time I reached for the gun, it's been increasingly easy. Actually, it's easier every time to reach for the gun, and it's harder to put it down every time. The solution surfaces again after more sin, after failing in business, losing a house, especially energetic, arguments at home, and sometimes it's a completely random thought while driving in my car, sitting at my desk. Like, just pull over. No one's home right now. Today could be the day. Why? Because we develop thought tracks, like a stream cuts into the ground by running long enough and it becomes a river. How does one choose to see through suicide to hope? That's what I had to decide to do. My friend Francine, Ronald, the guy I worked with. The suicide funnel begins with a thought. And each step deeper into the funnel is another thought. It's often really logical, very concrete from the perspective of the person in the funnel. When we last saw Sam and Samantha, our football fans that were suddenly tempted by a commercial to order pizza, they got that thought by a TV commercial. Then they ruminated on that thought for a while, and then another thought, and they debated whether they should order pizza or Chinese, and had a conversation about leftovers. And then Sam anchored himself on pizza. After a few helpful reinforcing commercials, they're ready to complete the transaction. At any point, they could have stopped. And literally any reason or excuse would have worked. Even if Sam and Samantha had felt like they were being carried away with the pizza idea, or, well, we've talked about it long enough, so we may as well just do it. The truth is that they're always in control the whole time. The suicide funnel is the same. Porn was the on-ramp for me. After enough driving, enough progression, and broadening my experience, embarrassment became shame. And sure, shame can curb behavior for a while, but it doesn't cure problems. And ongoing shame graduates to hopelessness and then resignation. The shame and self-hatred were already long-term residents for me before I took that load to Connecticut, but I hadn't been suicidal. It took just one more thought, happening to see my gun in the sleeper where I always kept it. That was enough. The bullet at the other end of the barrel held the solution. Eric, who had been my former patient, he took a different route than me, but had arrived at hopelessness by the time that we met. My friend Ronald got there through alcohol, and Peter, my friend the pastor, arrived there after the loss of his friend. There's wife record. Each of us become hopeless in different ways, but once there, we're each at the bottom of the suicide funnel, ready to complete the transaction. Peter did complete suicide. Ronald accidentally survived his attempt, which made for many years, made his feelings of hopelessness even worse. Eric was interrupted by his wife, who forced an intervention. So let's go down the funnel. There's lots of on-ramps. And like commercials, none of them are effective for every person, but most of them will work for many of us. On-ramps into the funnel are thoughts or behaviors that lead to embarrassment. I don't want anyone to know that I failed in business, that I lost my house, I was fired, my car was repoed, things like that. Or things about myself personally. Not things I did or things I've gone through, but who I am as a person. Too fat, girls complain their chest is too small or too big, I'm too slow. Well, self-deprecating thoughts like that. About things about myself that I can't change, like not without radical surgery. Or thoughts that we're fed about ourselves until we decide to believe them. And those thoughts become our own. You are stupid becomes I am stupid. You're told you're a bad person becomes I am a bad person. You're told you are worthless, that becomes I am worthless. I wasn't told that I was bad or worthless, but I got the message when I was choked or struck in the face with a belt buckle. An early level in the suicide funnel was isolation. Those thoughts, whether I created them or adopted them, or my embarrassment, led to isolation. I didn't want anyone to know, and the way to make sure they don't is to be isolated. The masks we wear assist in our isolation. If this were a self-defense class, well, this is about self-defense, right? So the masks are concealment. The shields we carry, a couple of minor deflection and sarcasm, maintain the distance and keep us hidden. In the world of self-defense, that's called the cover. Infection grows when a wound is not cleaned out and it's allowed to stay dirty. Embarrassment, not properly cared for because I don't know anyone who cares or because I don't trust that anyone does care, is initially just a wound. Those heal. Left untreated, embarrassment, especially kept moist by isolation, becomes shame. For most of my nursing career, I've worked in the ER. Lots of them. I've been over 20 facilities in 5 different states. Everywhere, people delay coming in to ask for help because they're embarrassed about, well, this is stupid. They don't want to see this in the ER. They're going to not want to take care of it. They're going to laugh at me at the nurse's station. Now, to be fair, I've heard that those things do sometimes happen. And if you got a few minutes, I can tell you some stories. But if the thought about being embarrassed had been dealt with earlier, I know hundreds of patients who would have had better outcomes and faster recoveries by seeking help when their problem was small. I'm one of them. I've had recurring cases of cellulitis in my leg. It's a skin infection. It's pretty easy to deal with when you catch it early. I'd let it go on long enough that it became sepsis. That's when a localized infection takes over the whole body, begins to impact the whole body. I've waited even longer still, so that when I've gone into the ER, I've had to be resuscitated. But in the beginning, it could have been dealt with by oral antibiotics. All because of my thought about my infection. Thousands of years ago, Jim wrote about thoughts, how thoughts become actions which can lead to death. Thoughts are the on-ramps into the suicide funnel. And if one chooses to see through suicide to hope, then taking control of our thoughts is the way back out. Imagine your yard at home as your mind, and imagine the rush of the springtime birds as thoughts. Your yard is your responsibility. You can't control the birds that fly over your yard. But can you control the birds that you let land in your yard? You just walk outside. That'll get something to fly away. In the force continuum that law enforcement is taught, their lowest level use of force is just presence. If y'all are parents, you experience this when you're kids. When you walk into the room, you being there changes their behavior. And just like a cop sitting on the side of the road, just when we see him there, right, we automatically react just to their presence. So letting your thoughts know that you are not present, taking an active interest in what's going on in this yard, in your mind, will have an effect on the thoughts that land in your yard, in your brain. So sitting outside watching the birds, you can decide that you like some and you don't like others. You can begin to create an environment, like a bird feeder, with your favorite bird's favorite food to attract the kind of birds that you do want. It also means curating your environment to discourage the kind of birds that you don't want. So you can control whether new birds land in your yard. You can also control the ones that have nests there, because you can take the nest down. When our youngest son was a toddler, I was going to Virginia for a week for meetings, and my wife was going to leave and go to northern Wisconsin for that same time. And she left, where any of y'all are moms, she left the same time that you would, when the toddler's going to take a nap in the car. Well, being a good dad, I know what kind of drinks he likes. She had filled his sippy cup with apple juice. I knew that he liked sipping on my energy drink. And that's the day I found out his sippy cup would hold an entire can of energy drink. So, being a good dad, I hooked him up. And then I got on the plane. So, they had a long ride up there. We didn't talk again until about 10 o'clock at night. And when we did, she sounded frazzled. She said, I don't know what happened, but he didn't sleep at all in the car, wouldn't let go of his sippy cup. It's 10 o'clock at night. He still hasn't taken a nap, and he's running around tearing up the house. Well, distance is protective, and time heals all wounds. And so I said, well, I don't know either. I don't think it has to do with the energy drink that I gave him. So the following week, I learned that time heals all wounds is not always true, and that distance is not always protective. So when you first begin to tear down the nests that these unwanted birds have been living in, the unwanted thoughts that have been invasive and come whenever they want and won't leave you alone, it's going to be like trying to control a toddler who's been raised on energy drinks and no adult supervision. It's going to be ugly, and you're going to suck at it. That's me being motivational. When we drove up here today, I saw a sign that said how many miles we still had to go. It was a long ways. I didn't get discouraged and sit on the side of the road though, thinking about why I wasn't there yet. No, we just kept going. That's what we do when we drive, right? And the next sign verifies that the last sign was right because it says you're getting closer. So when you start taking down these nests in your yard, these unwanted thoughts that have just been living there, it is going to be hard. You are going to suck at it. You should think of that as a road sign. So you are on the right route, but you expect it to be this way. You've probably seen it in your own neighborhood. Overgrown yards can be trimmed up and pruned again. Flowers can be planted in a garden. My mind, your mind, can be pruned again so that we like what we see when we look in the yard, and so that neighbors give compliments instead of scorn. So the pretty birds, the songbirds, the thoughts that we want in our own minds, so that they move in. So, my name's Steve, and I'm proof of it. The last time that I made a plan to finally get that project done that I'd started in Connecticut in '97, the last time I had a plan for doing that was in 2020. I was a traveling ER nurse then, and I finished a job in Minneapolis for the last 6 months. In fact, I was on duty the night that the Twin Cities got ransacked, and then that virus got introduced. So I finished up in Minneapolis after 6 months. I went home for a couple of days, and then I left for St. Louis, Missouri with a plan already in place. I was going to finish that assignment, reach some financial goals, find an out-of-the-way scenic overlook on my way home, and go for one more walk. I've never written a note. I haven't written a note because I don't want to write the things that I would have to write in order for the note to be true. 23 years is a long time to let birds build nests, to give thoughts free access to a man's mind. I had lots of disordered thinking. The key thought for me, when I finally began pruning my own mind and taking down the unwanted nests, came to me not long before I had finished that assignment. I hadn't picked up the gun, but I was looking at it, and I was thinking about when I'd start working my way home. The thought was, how important really must you be? By now that voice and I have had several conversations. The thought was a surprise to me, but not the fact that I would just get interrupted. You know, like a friend that you have, when they call and they just launch right into the conversation and don't even say hi. So my answer was, not very important. My boys and I aren't very close. I'm just another nurse in a sea of marginalized nurses. None of my friends at home call me when I'm traveling. My marriage often feels like roommates in tasks, logistics, instead of fun, romantic, and engaged. So, probably not very important at all. Well, if that's really true, then why do you think Satan tries so hard to get you killed? How would you respond if anyone else threatened you? Very differently. So you'd fight back if somebody else threatened you? Yeah, obviously. Of course I would. So that's very interesting to me, because here you sit creating plans for when would be the best time to get yourself killed. Nothing else has worked so far, and so Satan has made you your own worst enemy. So that makes me wonder how important you really must be. And silence was long enough that I hoped the conversation was over. I had never thought of it that way before, but it did make sense to me. I had become my own worst enemy. It wasn't over. Also, I was wondering whether you're actually going to help him do whatever his plans might be. So that was the key thought for me before I chose to begin to do the work to tend my own yard, my own mind. Before I decided to take control of which thoughts I allowed to build nests in my mind. So, I'm a Christian. I choose to find hope in the fact that even though, or actually exactly because, I'm not good enough, then I can be redeemed. I've destroyed relationships and I've tried to destroy others. I've had some successes, a string of failures, but the book says that Jesus is looking for failures and misfits and not whites like me. Because his answer is, that's perfect. I've been looking for a mess just like that. And if you give it to me, I'll buy it from you. You give that mess to me and I'll give you a new identity. I will call you redeemed. But the point isn't to make this a Billy Graham crusade, and I'm not in sales. I don't get a commission for doing the Great Commission. I do know a crystal clear answer for the question, where does hope come from, though? My friend Clint gave me the language for this. Clint Fleming is a friend of mine in Arkansas. He's a nurse coach too, and before that he'd been a firefighter and paramedic. Last year he wrote his book, he published his book, Responding to the Call, Resuscitating the Heart of Man Back to God. And he does in EMS we have a thing called the Chain of Survival. And in his book, Clint does a really good job of remaking that chain of survival into a metaphor about how the church is supposed to work. So in his book, he writes, relationship creates identity, identity bestows value, value reveals purpose, and purpose assigns responsibility. Still today, I have difficulty accepting my relationship. I've sometimes hidden my identity or I've found it different. Given that my rearview mirror is often bigger than my windshield, I tend to downplay or ignore my value. I'm the hypocrite in the room. I'm the guy talking about it, and I understand it, and I still sometimes act like Solomon wrote. This is all meaningless. But I've always known what my responsibilities are. So that's one of the disconnects, right? I'm focused on my responsibility. Jesus is focused on the relationship. But we're at a business, not a church, and it's Thursday, not Sunday. So we'll leave Jesus out of it for a bit. You don't have to believe what I do. And again, I'm not trying to sell you on it. So the framework will work regardless. All of these people had a breakdown in their chain of survival. Bad relationships, loss of identity, no sense of value, no real purpose. Or in my case, I was going to just abandon my responsibility. To choose to see hope, we have to choose to rebuild the links in the chain. When we're in healthy relationships, we feel safe. When we know who we are, we feel secure. We protect people who have value. The first time I chose to set the gun down is because I'd gotten a message that I had a purpose. Go pick up this freight, take it over there. If we had time, we could talk about some of my faults, but I've always, again, been a really good workaholic. My friend Francine carries an identity that she would not have chosen and didn't want. But it is hers, and she does carry it. That identity is, I'm a widow due to suicide, and it's given her a different value. She now has perspective and experience that most of us don't. So that value has given her purpose and protects her from the criticism of others, like your in-laws, for instance. She says, if I can help to save one person, then that's what I'm doing. So Francine sees the walking in events that she's part of to increase awareness of suicide to help break the stigma as her responsibility. So here's a practical, tangible way to begin combating those unwanted urges, those intrusive thoughts. Narcan is the antidote to narcotics like fentanyl. This is the Narcan for those intrusive thoughts. Think about things that are true. Think about things that are right. Think about things that are good. In 2020, when I went to Missouri, I was choosing to think about things that were false, that were wrong, that were bad. I decided that my boys weren't very close to me because I focused on some isolated events. And those thoughts became stronger and stronger, more real, until they seemed true. But the truth is, we do have a pretty good relationship. So direct contradictions isn't always a good idea in interpersonal relationships, but it's exactly the answer when you're fighting back against injected narcotics or false thinking. Recently, I was talking about controlling your thoughts with some teenagers. Have any of y'all created a playlist in your phone, like favorite songs, favorite artists? Okay. My wife doesn't. So she turns on the radio in the car and assumes just listening to random songs that happen to be played after they were chosen by somebody else. The teenagers had all created playlists in their phones. When they listen to music, it's music that they have curated, like someone who's trying to develop a museum. Those kids' songs have been specifically chosen by them. I suggested to the teenagers that they should do the same thing with their thoughts. They can, each of us can, choose which birds we allow to land in our yards, which thoughts we allow to land in our minds. And definitely we have to be careful which birds we allow to build nests there. However shame begins for a person, it quickly envelops us into that custom-fitted shame suit. And it's transparent, again, so that other people don't know you're wearing one. We're protected by the masks and shields that we developed to ensure that no one finds out we're wearing that shame suit. And we can languish in it for years before we finally begin doing the work to get out of it. When you find a friend, spouse, child, whoever it is, when you find someone wrapped in that thing, don't be sterile. Be willing to sit in the mud that they're in. Be just as dirty as they are. Let that person be all the emotions and rambling thoughts that they need to be. Policies and protocols and potential treatments do not remove the shame suit. Very often those things reinforce that fleet of birds. I am a failure. I am weak. I am stupid. Because I can't live up to those policies and protocols and treatment procedures, right? Instead, be the one who moves first. Be the one who's vulnerable and approachable first. We need to connect when we communicate. That's how we develop and grow relationships. Platitudes erode relationships and increase both distance and isolation. Remember that however deep you get into the funnel, whether it's the pizza for dinner or the suicide funnel, no matter how deep you get in the funnel, you're always in control of whether you remain in the funnel. For example, I once walked away from the signature line about to finance my favorite motorcycle. So right at the signature line, about to complete the transaction, I walked away from it. So at the bottom of the funnel, pizza, motorcycle, suicide, whatever it is, you can choose not to complete the transaction. How important are you, really? If you're in the suicide funnel, there has to be a reason that you've been convinced to become your own worst enemy. If I pointed a gun at you, or threatened to cut you, or tried to force you to take pills, well then the police would arrest me and you would press charges. You can choose to see through suicide to hope. And you do not need to do it alone. Some people who fit in one of our 4 groups need immediate crisis intervention. And that's available right here, right? So here, Kiefer, Northland Counseling, suicide prevention line, you can call 988. You can text TALK to 741-741. The mobile crisis unit in Itasca County, New Leaf Healing Center in Cohasset, the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. My friend Francine walks with the American Federation of Suicide Prevention. I'm a nurse coach. I work with clients and individuals or in groups. Not with people in immediate crisis. They need help that I'm not trained or equipped to provide. A lot of times folks need someone to work through ideas with and explore and hold emotions and thoughts. That's where coaching fits well. So think about those things as, especially in the hospital, I talk with patients about crutches versus wheelchair. Any of y'all been on crutches? Any of you had to ride around in a wheelchair? Huh?
Wheelchair's better.
Okay, I'm going to confront that in just a minute. So I've been on crutches a few times. I broke both my legs. If you're going to try that, I recommend one at a time. So I broke them both, so I've been on crutches a few times. My foster mom lives in a wheelchair. She's had polio since she was like 14. So her legs are just dead weight. If she wants to cross her legs, she has to grab her pant leg and pull her foot up. It's just dead weight. If she wants to go down the hallway, then she just mashes a joystick and just goes down the hallway. When she wants to get out of her chair into bed or whatever, her caregiver, she has a caregiver all the time, her caregiver puts a sling on her, mashes a button, she doesn't do any work, right? When you're on crutches, you have to do the work to go down the hall. You have to do the work to go up and down stairs. So it can get easy for us to, I hear complaints often that, well, I couldn't get in to see my doctor. My doctor's not giving me the right medicine. My therapist isn't helping me. Those people are riding in wheelchairs. They're actually just the victim here. They're waiting for somebody else to push them around. They're waiting for somebody else to fix whatever the thing is, right? I encourage people to use crutches instead. Crutches are, you have to do the work. When I was on crutches, I had to have them in order to be able to stand up straight. In fact, the crutches kept me from falling over because if I fell, I would get hurt even worse. So I needed outside support just to be able to stand up straight, right? Over time, I didn't need that support anymore. Over time, I was able to walk again. I still don't run a lot, but I was able to walk again by myself, right? So I used support for a while, which might be therapy, it might be medicine, it might be a psychiatrist, it might be any number of things, right? So I used support for a while until my strength was restored and I was able to do things on my own again. I encourage people to, one, look for crutches, right? Not that everything in the world should be a crutch. I mean, we can go too far that way, but what I mean is when you need support, look for crutches. Definitely look for crutches and not a wheelchair. That's it.